Hello, dear sleepyheads. Tonight we ride across the endless grasslands of Mongolia to a time when the thunder of hoofbeats could shake the earth and a single man's vision would reshape the known world. This is the tale of Temujin, who rose from abandonment and betrayal to become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler whose empire would stretch from sunrise to sunset, whose name would echo across continents for 800 years. Picture, if you will, a boy of 9 winters cast out onto the merciless steppes with nothing but his mother's fierce love and an iron will that would one day command millions. He would face starvation, slavery, and the constant threat of death. Yet from these ashes would emerge the greatest conqueror in human history. But before we gallop into this epic of triumph and terror, I want to thank you for joining me on these midnight journeys. If these stories of extraordinary lives bring you peace, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps me share more tales from history's most dramatic chapters. Now close your eyes and let us ride across the vast Mongolian steppes to meet the boy who would become the master of the world. In the year 1162, beneath the eternal blue sky of Mongolia, in a land where the horizon seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world itself, a child was born, clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. The shamans who witnessed this birth whispered among themselves, for such signs carried deep meaning on the steppes where every omen was read like words written in the wind. They declared that this child, named Temujin after a Tatar warrior his father had recently defeated, would one day hold the blood of his enemies in his hands. The Mongolia of Temujin's birth was a realm of breathtaking beauty and unspeakable harshness, where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the favor of the eternal blue sky that watched over all things. Endless grasslands rolled like green seas beneath massive skies, broken only by the winding paths of clear rivers and the distant silhouettes of sacred mountains. Here, nomadic tribes followed their herds across seasonal pastures, living in felt-covered gers that could be packed and moved with the rhythms of the natural world. The wind sang constantly across these vast plains, carrying with it the scents of wild herbs, the distant calls of eagles circling overhead, and the ever-present sound of horses moving through the grass. This was a land where time seemed measured not in hours or days, but in the migrations of animals, the changing of seasons, and the slow dance of constellations across the infinite dome of night sky. It was a harsh teacher, this wilderness, demanding absolute respect from those who would dare to call it home. The Mongol tribes of this era were caught in cycles of alliance and betrayal that had persisted for generations, each clan struggling for supremacy over grazing rights, trade routes, and the precious resources that meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. Warfare was as natural as the changing seasons, with raids and counter-raids creating a constant state of low-level conflict that tested every warrior's courage and skill. In this world, weakness meant death, and mercy was a luxury that few could afford. Temujin's father, Yesugei, was a minor chief of the Borjigin clan, a man whose reputation for courage and cunning had earned him respect among the scattered Mongol tribes. His marriage to Hoelun, Temujin's mother, had been secured through a typical steppe romance. He had kidnapped her from her previous husband during a raid, an act that was considered both acceptable and even romantic according to the customs of their time. Their union represented the kind of strategic alliance that could shift the balance of power among the competing tribal factions. Yasuge was known throughout the steppes as a man who could read the intentions of enemies in the flight patterns of birds, who could find water where others saw only endless grass, and who had never been unhorsed in single combat. His wisdom in choosing allies and timing raids had built the Borjigin clan into a force that commanded respect from the Karaites to the south and the Merkits to the north. Yet, for all his prowess as a warrior and leader, he understood that the greatest battles were often won through patience and careful planning rather than reckless courage. The felt-lined Ger, where Temujin spent his earliest years, was a world in miniature, containing everything necessary for nomadic life. Weapons hung from the latticed walls alongside tools for herding and crafting, while the family's most precious possessions, horses, silver ornaments, and heirloom swords, represented wealth that could be moved at a moment's notice. The young boy learned the fundamental skills of steppe life from birth: how to ride before he could properly walk, how to shoot a bow while galloping at full speed, and how to read the subtle signs that could mean the difference between finding water and dying of thirst. The education of a young Mongol warrior began with understanding horses, for on the steppes a man without a horse was already dead. Temujin learned to communicate with these magnificent animals through touch, voice, and intuition, developing the almost supernatural bond between rider and mount that would later make Mongol cavalry the terror of the known world. He practiced archery until his fingers bled, honing the accuracy that could drop a rabbit at full gallop or pierce armor at 200 paces. Most importantly, he absorbed the unwritten codes of honor and survival that governed steppe society. From his mother, Hoelun, Temujin learned the gentler arts that were equally essential for survival. She taught him to read the weather in the color of clouds, to find medicinal herbs among the grasses, and to understand the complex relationships between different tribal clans that could make the difference between welcome and warfare when approaching a strange camp. Her stories of ancient heroes and legendary battles filled his young mind with images of glory and conquest, while her practical wisdom about managing resources and planning for lean times instilled in him the strategic thinking that would later characterize his approach to empire building. The political landscape of Temujin's childhood was dominated by shifting alliances and blood feuds that could erupt into violence with little warning. The memory of ancient grievances passed from generation to generation, creating webs of obligation and enmity that influenced every interaction between tribes. Young Temujin observed his father's careful navigation of these treacherous waters, learning lessons about diplomacy, loyalty, and the price of trust that would shape his approach to leadership throughout his life. The shamanic traditions that provided spiritual guidance to the Mongol tribes taught that the eternal blue sky watched over all things, blessing those who showed courage and punishing those who displayed cowardice or treachery. The young boy participated in rituals that connected him to the sacred landscape of his homeland, learning to read omens in the flight of eagles, the patterns of clouds, and the behavior of his horses. These early spiritual experiences instilled in him a sense of destiny that would later manifest as an unshakable belief in his divine mission to unite the world under his rule. During the long winter months, when the herds were kept close to shelter and travel became difficult, the Jiar would fill with visiting relatives and allied warriors who shared news from distant regions and tales of recent conflicts. These gatherings provided young Temujin with his first education in the broader politics of the steppes. As he listened to debates about the relative strength of different tribes, the shifting patterns of alliance and enmity, and the opportunities and threats that characterized life beyond his immediate family circle. The daily rhythm of nomadic life shaped Temujin's understanding of the world in fundamental ways. The constant movement of the herds taught him that adaptation was essential for survival, while the harsh realities of steppe weather demonstrated that nature could be both provider and destroyer. The young boy learned to find shelter in storms, to locate water in drought, and to read the subtle signs that warned of approaching danger. These skills, learned in childhood play and adolescent training, would later enable him to lead armies across vast distances under conditions that would defeat less prepared commanders. The family structure of the Borjigin clan provided Temujin with his first lessons in leadership and responsibility. As the eldest son, he was expected to set an example for his younger brothers, while learning to manage the complex relationships that held the extended family together. He observed his father's dealings with uncles, cousins, and in-laws, noting how successful leadership required balancing competing interests while maintaining the respect and loyalty of followers. These early experiences with family politics would prove invaluable when he later faced the challenge of uniting hostile tribes under his authority. The economic foundation of Mongol society rested on the careful management of livestock that provided food, clothing, shelter, and transportation for the nomadic tribes. Temujin learned to evaluate horses for speed, endurance, and temperament, understanding that the quality of his mount could determine his fate in battle or during long journeys across the steppes. He studied the breeding cycles of sheep and cattle, recognizing that wealth on the steppes was measured in living animals rather than gold or land. This understanding of pastoral economics would later influence his approach to governing conquered territories, as he sought to preserve and enhance productive capabilities rather than simply extracting tribute. The storytelling traditions of his people provided Temujin with models of heroic behavior and strategic thinking that would influence his entire career. Around evening fires, he heard tales of legendary warriors who had overcome impossible odds through courage, cunning, and divine favor. The epic stories of ancient heroes contained practical lessons about leadership, warfare, and diplomacy disguised as entertainment, providing the young boy with a cultural inheritance that prepared him for the challenges he would later face. These narratives also instilled in him a sense of his own potential greatness, as he recognized similarities between his circumstances and those of the heroes whose deeds were celebrated in song and story. The hunting expeditions that punctuated the seasonal routine provided Temujin with his first taste of organized warfare, as the tactics used to surround and capture wild game closely resembled those employed in military campaigns. He learned to coordinate his movements with other riders, to anticipate the behavior of prey under pressure, and to strike decisively when opportunities presented themselves. These skills would prove directly applicable to the battlefield, where the ability to maneuver large groups of mounted warriors in coordinated patterns would become the foundation of Mongol military supremacy. The crisis that would transform Temujin's comfortable childhood into a struggle for survival came when he was only 9 years old. His father, Yesugei, while returning from negotiations to arrange his son's betrothal to a girl from a neighboring tribe, stopped to share a meal with some Tatar warriors he encountered on the steppe. The Tatars, remembering old grievances against the Borjigin clan, poisoned their guest's food, sending him home to die slowly and painfully while his family watched helplessly. The betrothal negotiations that had occupied Yesugei's final journey represented the kind of long-term strategic thinking that characterized successful steppe leadership. The proposed marriage between young Temujin and Berta, daughter of a Kongirad chief, would have created an alliance that strengthened both clans while providing security for future generations. The careful planning that had gone into these arrangements made their disruption by Yesugei's death all the more devastating, as it left important political relationships in limbo and created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Yesugei's death throes lasted for days, during which the dying chief attempted to prepare his young son for the responsibilities that would fall to him far earlier than anyone had expected. Through gritted teeth and waves of agony, he shared final wisdom about the treacherous nature of steppe politics and the importance of remembering both friends and enemies. He spoke of the blood clot that had marked Temujin's birth, reminding the boy that destiny often revealed itself through signs that seemed insignificant at the time. Most importantly, he emphasized that survival on the steppes required the ability to inspire both love and fear in others, for a leader who could command only one of these emotions was doomed to failure. The poisoning itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, as the Tatars had chosen a substance that caused maximum suffering while ensuring that their victim would have time to understand exactly who was responsible for his fate. This method sent a clear message to the Borjigin clan about the price of opposing Tatar interests, while also demonstrating the sophistication of steppe political warfare. The slow death allowed Yesugei to settle his affairs and attempt to secure his family's future, but it also created a prolonged period of uncertainty that his enemies could exploit to maximum advantage. The symptoms of the poison manifested gradually, beginning with stomach cramps and nausea that might have been attributed to bad food or travel fatigue. As the toxin spread through his system, Yesugei experienced increasing pain and weakness that made it clear he was dying from more than natural causes. The realization that he had been murdered by men who had shared his food and accepted his hospitality added psychological torment to his physical suffering, as he understood that his death would leave his family vulnerable to the very enemies who had orchestrated his demise. Yesugei's death created a power vacuum that his followers were quick to abandon. The alliance that had sustained the Borjigin clan dissolved as lesser chiefs decided that Holun and her young children represented weakness rather than strength. In a council meeting that would haunt Temujin for the rest of his life, the tribal elders declared that they would not follow a woman and her children, preferring to cast their lot with stronger leaders who could provide better protection and more opportunities for wealth through raiding. The abandonment of Holun and her family was carried out with the casual cruelty that characterized steppe politics. Former allies simply packed their jurs and rode away during the night, taking with them the herds and warriors that had made the Borjigin clan a force to be respected. By dawn, Temujin found himself responsible for protecting his mother, 3 younger brothers, and sister, with nothing but a few horses, and the bitter knowledge that loyalty was a commodity that could disappear as quickly as morning mist. The immediate aftermath of the abandonment was almost surreal in its completeness. The campsite that had buzzed with activity the night before stood empty except for a few worn jurs and the scattered possessions that their former followers had deemed too worthless to steal. The silence was broken only by the wind through the grass and the distant calls of birds, creating an atmosphere of desolation that seemed to echo the family's desperate circumstances. Holun gathered her children around her and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "We have nothing now but our own strength and the favor of the eternal blue sky." The psychological impact of witnessing this betrayal was devastating for young Temujin, who had believed that the bonds of loyalty and friendship that connected his father's followers to their clan were unbreakable. The discovery that men who had sworn oaths of allegiance could simply walk away when circumstances became difficult taught him harsh lessons about human nature that would influence his approach to leadership throughout his life. From this moment forward, he would understand that loyalty must be earned and maintained through constant demonstration of strength and success. The years that followed tested every survival skill that Temujin had learned during his privileged childhood. The family was forced to forage for roots and berries, catch fish with improvised nets, and hunt small game with bows that were barely adequate for such work. They lived in constant fear of discovery by enemies who would view them as easy targets for robbery or revenge. The young boy, who had once been groomed for leadership, found himself reduced to the most basic struggle for daily survival. The transformation from comfortable tribal aristocrats to desperate refugees required the family to develop entirely new skills and ways of thinking. Holun, who had been raised to manage a large household and supervise the work of many servants, now found herself teaching her children to dig for edible roots and recognize which plants were safe to eat. Temujin learned to set traps for small animals, to move silently through tall grass, and to read the signs that might warn of approaching danger from human or animal predators. The psychological impact of this abandonment created scars that would influence Temujin's character for the rest of his life. The betrayal by his father's followers taught him that loyalty based on convenience was worthless, while trust extended to the wrong people could prove fatal. He developed an almost supernatural ability to assess character and motivation, learning to identify potential allies and enemies through subtle observations of behavior and body language. Most importantly, he began to formulate the principles of absolute loyalty and ruthless pragmatism that would later characterize his approach to building and maintaining his empire. The practical skills that the family developed during their years of exile would prove invaluable during Temujin's later military campaigns. They learned to move silently through tall grass, to hide in terrain that seemed to offer no concealment, and to survive on rations that would have seemed impossibly meager during their days of prosperity. They developed the heightened awareness of danger that characterized successful predators, learning to detect the approach of enemies or the presence of game through subtle changes in animal behavior or shifts in the wind. The leadership qualities that would later make Temujin famous began to manifest during these years of hardship, as he gradually assumed responsibility for his family's survival and protection. His younger brothers looked to him for guidance and protection, while his mother increasingly relied on his judgment in making decisions about where to travel and how to find food. The experience of being responsible for others' lives under desperate circumstances taught him lessons about leadership that no amount of traditional education could have provided. The hardships of these early years were punctuated by moments of violence that revealed the brutal realities of steppe life. When Temujin and his half-brother Bekta quarreled over hunting spoils, the dispute escalated into a confrontation that ended with Temujin killing his sibling with arrows shot from ambush. This act, which horrified his mother but was accepted as necessary by steppe standards, demonstrated the young man's willingness to use extreme measures to protect his family's interests and establish his authority as the undisputed leader of their small band. The quarrel with Bekta had been building for months as the half-brother increasingly challenged Temujin's authority and claimed an equal share of their meager hunting successes. The tension came to a head when Bekta took a fish that Temujin and Kasar had caught, claiming that as an older son, he had the right to the best portions of any food the family acquired. The theft was not just about the fish itself, but about the larger question of who would lead the family and make decisions about their survival. The incident with Bekta also revealed Temujin's emerging ability to inspire loyalty in others. His younger brother Kasar and adopted brother Belgutay supported his decision to eliminate a rival who threatened family unity, showing the kind of unquestioning devotion that would later characterize the relationship between Genghis Khan and his closest followers. The young man was already demonstrating the charismatic leadership qualities that would enable him to unite tribes that had been enemies for generations. The killing of Bekta was not an act of sudden rage, but the culmination of a growing conflict over resources and authority that had threatened to destroy the family's fragile unity. The half-brother had begun to challenge Temujin's leadership decisions and to claim an equal share of their meager hunting successes, creating tensions that could not be resolved through negotiation or compromise. In the harsh calculus of steppe survival, eliminating internal threats was often more important than maintaining family harmony, and Temujin's action demonstrated his understanding of this fundamental principle. The aftermath of Bekta's death created a period of mourning and reflection that revealed the complex emotions underlying family relationships on the steppes. Holun grieved for her lost stepson while recognizing the necessity of his elimination, understanding that her family's survival might have been impossible if the internal conflict had continued. The younger children were shaken by the violence, but gradually came to understand that their elder brother's harsh decision had been motivated by love for the family rather than personal ambition or cruelty. The years of exile also provided Temujin with his first experiences of the broader political landscape beyond his immediate family circle. Traveling across the steppes in search of food and shelter, the family encountered other displaced groups, solitary travelers, and representatives of various tribal factions. These meetings provided the young man with intelligence about the current state of steppe politics and the opportunities that might exist for someone clever enough to exploit them. During their wanderings, the family sometimes found temporary shelter with distant relatives or sympathetic strangers who were willing to provide brief respite from their constant struggle for survival. These encounters taught Temujin valuable lessons about hospitality and reciprocity that would later influence his approach to diplomacy and alliance building. He learned to assess potential allies quickly, to offer appropriate gifts or services in exchange for assistance, and to leave relationships in such a way that future cooperation remained possible. The capture and enslavement that followed represented the lowest point of Temujin's early life, when former enemies finally tracked down Hoelun's family and decided to make an example of the boy who had dared to challenge their authority. Taken prisoner by the Taichiud clan, he was forced to wear a wooden collar that marked him as a slave while enduring the daily humiliations designed to break his spirit and eliminate any thoughts of revenge or escape. For months, he performed menial tasks under constant guard, his captors believing that time and degradation would transform the proud young warrior into a broken servant. The wooden collar itself was an ingenious instrument of both physical restraint and psychological torment, designed to prevent escape while constantly reminding the prisoner of his degraded status. The device was heavy enough to tire the wearer during prolonged activity, while its bulk made rapid movement impossible and marked the slave as clearly as any brand. The humiliation of wearing this symbol of servitude was intended to destroy the pride and self-respect that made resistance possible, gradually transforming the captive into someone who accepted his fate as natural and unchangeable. The daily routine of slavery was calculated to break down Temujin's sense of identity and self-worth through constant humiliation and degradation. He was forced to perform the most menial tasks, cleaning animal waste, hauling water, and serving food to his captors, while being reminded constantly of his helpless status. The Taichiud warriors took pleasure in describing the fate that awaited his family members if they were captured, using psychological torture to compound the physical hardships of captivity. Instead, the experience of slavery only strengthened Temujin's resolve and sharpened his understanding of human nature. He observed his captors carefully, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses, and cultivating relationships with those who showed him small kindnesses. When the opportunity for escape finally presented itself during a tribal celebration, he was ready to seize it with the desperate courage of a man who understood that freedom might be worth more than life itself. The patience that Temujin displayed during his captivity demonstrated the strategic thinking that would later characterize his approach to military and political challenges. Rather than attempting futile escapes that would only result in harsher treatment, he studied his situation carefully and waited for the optimal moment to act. This ability to suppress immediate impulses in favor of long-term planning would become one of his greatest assets as a leader, enabling him to achieve objectives that seemed impossible to those who lacked his patience and foresight. The escape itself became the stuff of legend, as Temujin used the cover of darkness and his intimate knowledge of steppe geography to evade pursuit by warriors who were more familiar with the local terrain. His ability to survive alone on the grasslands, finding food and water while avoiding recapture, demonstrated the practical skills and mental toughness that would later enable him to lead armies across vast distances under the most challenging conditions. The young man who returned to his family's hidden camp was no longer the boy who had been captured. He had been transformed into someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. The details of the escape revealed the careful planning and patient observation that had characterized Temujin's approach to his captivity. He had noted which guards were most likely to drink heavily during celebrations, which routes offered the best chances of avoiding pursuit, and which natural landmarks could guide him back to his family's approximate location. The escape was not a desperate improvisation, but a carefully calculated operation that demonstrated the strategic thinking that would later characterize his military campaigns. The assistance he received from a sympathetic guard during his escape illustrated the charismatic qualities that even captivity could not suppress. Despite his degraded circumstances, Temujin had managed to inspire enough loyalty in at least one of his captors to secure help during his most desperate hour. This ability to win followers, even under the most adverse conditions, would become one of his greatest assets as he began his rise to power, enabling him to attract support from unexpected sources throughout his career. The return to his family marked the beginning of Temujin's transformation from survivor to leader, as he began to attract followers who recognized his exceptional qualities and potential for future greatness. His reputation for courage and cunning spread across the steppes, drawing young warriors who were dissatisfied with their current circumstances and eager to serve a leader who might offer them opportunities for advancement and wealth. These early followers formed the core of what would eventually become the most formidable military organization in human history. The first warriors to join Temujin's band were mostly younger sons of minor chiefs, men whose birth order or clan status limited their opportunities for advancement under the existing tribal hierarchies. They were attracted by his reputation for fairness in distributing captured wealth, his willingness to promote followers based on merit rather than birth, and his obvious potential for achieving the kind of success that could make his supporters wealthy and powerful. These early recruits provided the foundation for the revolutionary military organization that would later characterize the Mongol Empire. The gradual accumulation of followers during this period was carefully managed by Temujin, who understood that rapid expansion could create instabilities that might destroy his growing organization before it had time to develop properly. He screened potential recruits carefully, ensuring that each new member shared his commitment to absolute loyalty and military excellence. The bonds that developed between these early followers were strengthened by shared hardships and mutual dependence, creating a core group that would remain faithful to their leader throughout the challenges that lay ahead. The marriage to Berta, his childhood betrothed, represented both a personal triumph and a strategic alliance that provided Temujin with his first taste of political success. The bride price paid by her family included valuable horses and equipment that enhanced his status among potential followers, while the connection to her clan opened new possibilities for building the network of alliances that would be essential for his rise to power. The young couple's obvious affection for each other also provided a model of partnership that would influence Temujin's approach to relationships throughout his life. Berta herself was no ordinary stepwoman, but an intelligent and strong-willed partner who understood the political dimensions of their marriage and actively supported her husband's ambitions. Her family connections provided access to resources and information that proved crucial during the early phases of Temujin's career, while her personal qualities helped to attract other women to their growing community. The marriage represented not just a romantic union, but a political alliance that strengthened both families and created new possibilities for cooperation among previously unrelated tribal groups. The wedding celebration itself was a major political event that announced Temujin's emergence as a significant figure in Mongol society. Warriors and chiefs from across the steppes attended the festivities, providing opportunities for networking and alliance building that would have been impossible under other circumstances. The generous hospitality that Temujin provided during the celebration demonstrated his growing wealth and status, while the quality of his bride reflected his rising reputation among the tribes that controlled the most desirable marriage alliances. The happiness of the wedding was enhanced by the recognition that it represented the fulfillment of agreements made by Temujin's father before his death, demonstrating the young man's commitment to honoring family obligations even under the most difficult circumstances. The successful completion of the betrothal arrangements also provided evidence of his growing political skills, as he had managed to maintain important relationships despite years of exile and hardship that might have been expected to destroy such connections. However, the happiness of his marriage was short-lived, as enemies who remembered old grievances soon struck at him through the most devastating attack imaginable. Berta's kidnapping by Merkid raiders seeking revenge for Holun's abduction by Yesugei demonstrated the cyclical nature of steppe violence and the impossibility of escaping the consequences of past actions. The attack also revealed the limitations of Temujin's power at this stage of his career, as he possessed neither the warriors nor the resources necessary to immediately rescue his beloved wife. The Merkid raid was planned and executed with the precision of a military operation, demonstrating that Temujin's enemies possessed the intelligence and capability necessary to strike at his most vulnerable points. The raiders had studied his routines and defenses, identifying the optimal time and method for their attack, while ensuring that they could withdraw quickly before reinforcements could arrive. The kidnapping of Berta was not a random act of violence, but a calculated political statement designed to humiliate the rising young leader and demonstrate his inability to protect those under his care. The timing of the raid was particularly devastating, as it occurred during the early months of Temujin's marriage, when he was still consolidating his position and building the alliances that would be necessary for long-term success. The loss of his wife not only created personal anguish, but also damaged his reputation among potential followers who might question his ability to protect them if he could not even safeguard his own household. The psychological impact of the attack was thus as significant as its immediate military consequences. The months that followed Berta's capture tested every aspect of Temujin's character and political skill. Rather than launching a hopeless rescue attempt that would likely result in his own death and his wife's continued captivity, he chose to engage in the patient work of building alliances and gathering resources for a successful campaign. This decision required him to suppress his personal anguish in favor of strategic thinking, demonstrating the kind of disciplined leadership that would later enable him to make difficult decisions for the good of his empire, even when they conflicted with his personal preferences. The emotional cost of this delay was enormous, as Temujin was forced to endure months of uncertainty about his wife's fate, while maintaining the composed exterior necessary for effective leadership. The not knowing whether Berta was alive or dead, whether she was being treated with the respect due to a chief's wife or subjected to the brutal treatment often accorded to captive women, created a form of psychological torture that tested his mental resilience to its limits. Yet he understood that premature action might doom both his wife and his own political future, requiring him to channel his rage and desperation into productive activities. The alliance negotiations that occupied this period provided Temujin with valuable experience in the diplomatic skills that would later prove essential for managing his expanding empire. He learned to present his case persuasively to potential allies, to identify the interests and motivations that drove other leaders' decisions, and to structure agreements that would provide mutual benefits while maintaining his own freedom of action. These early diplomatic experiences taught him that successful negotiations required understanding the other party's perspective and offering genuine advantages rather than simply demanding support. The alliance with Jamuka, his childhood friend and blood brother, provided Temujin with the military support necessary to launch his first major campaign. Jamuka commanded substantial forces and possessed the kind of established reputation that could attract additional warriors to their cause. The partnership between the two young leaders seemed natural, combining Temujin's emerging strategic abilities with Jamuka's existing power base. However, the relationship also contained the seeds of future conflict, as both men possessed the ambition and capability necessary for supreme leadership. The blood brotherhood ceremony that had united Temujin and Jamuka in their youth represented one of the most sacred bonds in Mongol society, creating obligations that were supposed to supersede even family loyalty. The ritual involved sharing blood and swearing oaths before the eternal blue sky, creating a spiritual connection that was believed to persist even after death. The breaking of such bonds was considered one of the most serious crimes possible in steppe society, carrying consequences that extended beyond the immediate participants to their families and followers. The successful rescue of Berta marked Temujin's emergence as a significant force in Mongol politics, demonstrating his ability to organize complex military operations and inspire loyalty among diverse tribal groups. The campaign itself showcased tactical innovations that would later characterize Mongol warfare: rapid movement, coordinated attacks by multiple units, and the systematic destruction of enemy resistance. The victory also established his reputation for protecting those under his care, a quality that would prove crucial in attracting followers who valued security above all other considerations. The military operation that secured Berta's freedom was a masterpiece of planning and execution that revealed Temujin's emerging abilities as a strategic commander. The combined forces moved across difficult terrain with remarkable speed and coordination, avoiding detection until they were in position to strike decisively at the Merkid camp. The attack itself was timed to take advantage of the enemy's vulnerabilities while minimizing the risk to captive women who might be harmed during the fighting. The psychological impact of the successful rescue extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, as it demonstrated that Temujin possessed the leadership qualities necessary to inspire extraordinary efforts from his followers. The warriors who participated in the campaign had risked their lives for a cause that brought them no immediate material benefit, motivated purely by loyalty to their leader and confidence in his eventual success. This demonstration of charismatic leadership would prove invaluable in future recruitment efforts, as potential followers recognized that service under Temujin offered opportunities for both adventure and advancement. The birth of Yochi, Berta's first child, created both joy and uncertainty in Temujin's personal life. The timing of the pregnancy raised questions about the boy's paternity that would influence succession politics for decades to come, though Temujin chose to acknowledge Yochi as his son, regardless of biological uncertainty. This decision reflected both his deep love for Berta and his understanding that leadership sometimes required accepting ambiguous situations rather than demanding perfect clarity about every issue. The question of Shochi's parentage would never be definitively resolved, creating a source of tension within the family that would persist throughout Temujin's reign and beyond. Some whispered that the boy was the son of a Merkid warrior, while others maintained that his conception had occurred before his mother's capture. Temujin's public acceptance of Yochi as his heir apparent demonstrated his ability to place political necessity above personal pride, though the private doubts may have influenced his relationship with his eldest son in subtle ways. The growing tension with Jamuka represented the inevitable result of two strong leaders trying to share authority within the same political space. Their friendship, which had survived the hardships of childhood and the challenges of their early careers, could not withstand the pressures created by their competing ambitions and different visions for the future of the Mongol tribes. The breaking point came when their followers clashed over resources and prestige, forcing both leaders to choose between personal loyalty and political necessity. The specific incident that triggered their separation involved a dispute over the spoils of a joint raiding expedition, with both leaders' followers claiming the right to the most valuable captives and livestock. What began as a simple disagreement over distribution quickly escalated into questions about leadership hierarchy and decision-making authority. The conflict revealed fundamental differences in their approaches to leadership, with Temujin favoring merit-based advancement, while Jamuka preferred traditional tribal hierarchies. The philosophical differences between the two leaders extended beyond mere questions of military organization to encompass broader visions of how Mongol society should develop. Jamuka represented the traditional approach that maintained existing social structures and respected established privileges, while Temujin advocated for revolutionary changes that would create opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their birth status. These competing ideologies could not coexist indefinitely within the same political movement, making conflict inevitable as their power and influence grew. The separation from Jamuka and the beginning of their rivalry marked Temujin's transformation from a junior partner in someone else's alliance to an independent leader responsible for his own destiny. The followers who chose to remain with him rather than following the more established Jamuka did so because they recognized something exceptional in his character and leadership style. These men formed the foundation of what would become the Mongol Empire, bound together by personal loyalty to a leader who offered them opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth. The decision to break with Jamuka was one of the most difficult of Temujin's early career, as it meant abandoning not only a valuable political alliance, but also a cherished personal relationship. The two leaders met one final time to formally dissolve their blood brotherhood, a ceremony that was conducted with the solemnity appropriate to such a momentous occasion. They parted with mutual respect, but also with the understanding that they were now enemies whose conflict would likely end only with the death or total defeat of one of them. The ritual of dissolving their blood brotherhood was as elaborate and significant as the ceremony that had originally created it. Both men understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there could be no return, severing bonds that had been considered sacred and inviolable. The shamans who presided over the ceremony warned both leaders about the spiritual consequences of breaking such oaths, while the witnesses understood that they were observing the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of the steppes. The years of tribal warfare that followed tested every aspect of Temujin's developing abilities as a military commander and political strategist. Each campaign taught him valuable lessons about tactics, logistics, and the psychology of leadership, while every victory attracted new followers who enhanced his growing reputation. He learned to balance the need for decisive action with the patience required for long-term planning, developing the strategic vision that would later enable him to coordinate military operations across multiple continents simultaneously. The first major military engagement between Temujin and Jamuka occurred at Dalan Balzut, where the former blood brothers tested their respective military innovations against each other. The battle showcased the tactical flexibility that would become a hallmark of Temujin's approach to warfare, as he adapted his formations and strategies in response to changing conditions on the battlefield. Though the immediate result was inconclusive, The engagement demonstrated that Temujin had developed into a formidable military commander, capable of matching his former mentor's experience and reputation. The innovations in military organization that Temujin introduced during this period would revolutionize warfare throughout the known world. His decimal system of organization, dividing armies into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, created unprecedented flexibility and coordination capabilities. His emphasis on merit-based promotion rather than hereditary privilege attracted the best talent from across the steppes, while his policies of religious tolerance and cultural adaptation enabled him to incorporate diverse populations into his growing empire. The decimal system was more than just an organizational innovation. It was a revolutionary approach to military command that broke down traditional tribal loyalties and created new bonds based on shared service and mutual dependence. Warriors from different tribes found themselves serving together in mixed units, gradually developing loyalty to their commanders and comrades rather than to their original clan leaders. This system made large-scale desertion nearly impossible while creating an esprit de corps that transcended traditional ethnic and tribal boundaries. The promotion system that Temujin established was equally revolutionary, as it offered advancement opportunities to talented individuals regardless of their social background or tribal affiliation. Slaves who demonstrated exceptional courage or skill could rise to command positions, while the sons of chiefs who failed to prove themselves might find their authority challenged by more capable subordinates. This meritocratic approach attracted the ablest warriors from across the steppes, while ensuring that leadership positions were filled by individuals who had demonstrated their competence in actual combat. The psychological warfare techniques that Temujin developed during this period would become as important as his tactical innovations in determining the outcome of future campaigns. He understood that defeating an enemy's will to fight was often more effective than simply destroying their military forces, leading him to develop sophisticated methods for undermining enemy morale while strengthening the confidence and cohesion of his own followers. These techniques included strategic use of terror, propaganda, and demonstration of overwhelming force at crucial moments. The intelligence networks that Temujin established during his rise to power provided him with unprecedented knowledge of enemy movements, intentions, and capabilities. Merchants, herders, and travelers throughout the steppes provided information in exchange for protection and favorable treatment, creating a web of informants that extended far beyond his immediate sphere of control. This intelligence advantage enabled him to anticipate enemy actions and position his forces for maximum effectiveness, while avoiding costly surprises that might have derailed his carefully planned campaigns. The first major test of this new military system came during the campaign against the Taichiud clan, the same tribe that had once held Temujin as a slave. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved, as the former captive returned as a conqueror to settle old scores with his former captors. The systematic destruction of Taichiud resistance demonstrated both the effectiveness of Temujin's military innovations and his personal commitment to repaying those who had wronged him during his years of vulnerability. The campaign against the Taichiud was conducted with a thoroughness that served as both military necessity and personal vendetta. Temujin's forces moved through Taichiud territory like a consuming fire, destroying not only military resistance, but also the economic foundation that had supported the tribe's power. Herds were captured or slaughtered, water sources were poisoned, and settlements were burned to ensure that the Taichiud could never again threaten their former captive or his followers. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond its immediate military objectives, as word spread throughout the steppes that Temujin was a leader who never forgot either kindness or injury. Potential enemies began to reconsider their opposition to his growing power, while potential allies were encouraged by his demonstration of loyalty to those who supported him. The message was clear. Alliance with Temujin offered both protection and opportunity, while opposition brought certain destruction. The elimination of smaller rivals continued systematically as Temujin consolidated his control over the central Mongol tribes. Each victory brought new resources, followers, and territory under his authority, while also removing potential obstacles to his ultimate goal of unifying all the nomadic peoples under his leadership. The pace of conquest accelerated as his military machine became more efficient, and his reputation made resistance seem increasingly futile to those who might otherwise have opposed him. The psychological transformation that occurred within Temujin during this period was as significant as his military and political achievements. The abandoned child who had once struggled for daily survival had developed into a leader whose confidence and strategic vision seemed unlimited. The harsh experiences of his youth had forged a character that could make the difficult decisions necessary for supreme leadership, while maintaining the charismatic qualities that inspired absolute loyalty in his followers. The series of battles that culminated in Jamuka's final defeat demonstrated the evolution of Mongol military tactics under Temujin's leadership. The traditional reliance on individual courage and small unit tactics was supplemented by sophisticated coordination between different types of forces and careful planning that took advantage of terrain, weather, and enemy psychology. These innovations made Mongol armies increasingly effective against traditional steppe warfare methods, while preparing them for the even greater challenges of attacking fortified cities and organized states. The capture and execution of Jamuka marked the end of the last serious challenge to Temujin's supremacy among the Mongol tribes. The former blood brothers' final meeting was conducted with the dignity appropriate to their shared history, as Jamuka acknowledged his defeat while requesting an honorable death befitting a warrior of his stature. Temujin granted this request, demonstrating both mercy toward a fallen enemy and respect for the traditions that governed steppe warfare. The death of Jamuka was orchestrated to send specific messages to different audiences throughout the steppes. For his followers, it demonstrated that their leader was capable of making the hard choices necessary for ultimate victory while still honoring the codes of conduct that governed relationships between warriors. For potential enemies, it showed that opposition to Temujin's authority would be met with inevitable defeat, while for potential allies, it illustrated that surrender and submission would be treated with appropriate respect and dignity. The Kurultai that proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler, in 1206 represented the culmination of decades of struggle and the beginning of a new phase of expansion that would transform the political map of the world. The man who had once been abandoned as a child now commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of warriors, all united by their devotion to a leader who had proven his worthiness through courage, wisdom, and an unbreakable will to succeed. The Kurultai itself was a gathering unlike any previous tribal assembly, bringing together representatives from across the Mongol Confederation to participate in a ceremony that would establish new precedents for leadership and governance. The shamans who presided over the proceedings declared that Temujin's elevation had been ordained by the eternal blue sky, providing religious legitimacy for his unprecedented authority over previously independent tribes. The oaths of loyalty sworn by the assembled chiefs created bonds that superseded traditional tribal obligations, establishing the foundation for the unified military organization that would soon threaten the stability of the entire known world. The selection of the title Genghis Khan reflected both the scope of his ambitions and the religious foundation of his authority. The name meant universal ruler or oceanic ruler, suggesting dominion that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of steppe politics to encompass all peoples under the eternal blue sky. The religious connotations of the title emphasized his role as an agent of divine will, providing both legitimacy for his authority and justification for the conquests that would follow. The transformation from Temujin to Genghis Khan was more than merely ceremonial, as it marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to extend Mongol authority beyond the traditional boundaries of steppe politics. The new Great Khan's vision encompassed not just the unification of the nomadic tribes, but the conquest of the settled civilizations that had long regarded themselves as superior to the barbarians of the grasslands. This ambition would drive the next phase of his extraordinary career and establish his legacy as one of history's most transformative figures. The administrative genius that Genghis Khan revealed in organizing his vast tribal confederation demonstrated abilities that went far beyond simple military leadership. He created a legal code, the Yasa, that established uniform laws across all Mongol territories, eliminating the chaos of competing tribal customs that had plagued the steppes for centuries. His decree of religious tolerance protected the rights of Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and shamanists alike, creating a level of spiritual freedom that was virtually unknown in the medieval world. Most revolutionary of all, he abolished hereditary aristocracy within his army, promoting officers based solely on merit and loyalty rather than bloodline. The Yasa itself was a remarkable document that reflected Genghis Khan's understanding of the challenges involved in governing a diverse empire composed of nomadic and sedentary populations with vastly different cultural traditions. The code emphasized practical concerns over abstract principles, establishing clear penalties for crimes while providing flexibility for local customs that did not conflict with imperial authority. The emphasis on religious tolerance reflected both strategic calculation and genuine belief in the value of diversity, as the Great Khan recognized that forced conversion would create unnecessary resistance among conquered populations. The legal innovations contained within the Yasa extended beyond simple criminal law to address questions of property rights, military organization, and international relations that would become crucial as the Mongol Empire expanded. The code established principles for the treatment of ambassadors that would revolutionize diplomatic practice, while its provisions regarding trade and commerce created the legal framework for the economic integration that would make the Mongol Empire one of history's most prosperous political entities. The transformation of Mongol society under his rule was as dramatic as any military conquest. Traditional tribal boundaries dissolved as warriors were reorganized into decimal units that mixed men from different clans, creating loyalty to the Khan rather than to local chiefs. Wives and children of defeated enemies were incorporated into Mongol society rather than enslaved, a policy that both demonstrated mercy and rapidly expanded the population available for military service. The systematic adoption of useful technologies and administrative practices from conquered peoples created a synergy that made the Mongol war machine increasingly formidable with each victory. The integration of defeated populations into Mongol society was handled with remarkable sophistication, as Genghis Khan understood that lasting conquest required more than military dominance. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and administrators were given positions of responsibility that utilized their expertise while binding them to the imperial cause through self-interest. Religious leaders who submitted peacefully were protected and honored, ensuring that conquered populations would receive spiritual guidance that supported rather than undermined imperial authority. The intelligence networks that Genghis Khan established to support his expanding empire represented another crucial innovation that contributed to his unprecedented success. Merchants, diplomats, and refugees provided detailed information about the strengths and weaknesses of potential targets, while captured engineers and administrators were recruited to serve the growing empire. This systematic gathering and analysis of information enabled the Mongols to exploit every advantage and avoid the kind of costly mistakes that had doomed previous nomadic invasions of settled territories. The merchant networks that provided much of this intelligence were protected and encouraged by Mongol policies that created unprecedented security for long-distance trade. The Pax Mongolica that Genghis Khan established along trade routes made commercial travel safer than it had been for centuries, while his standardization of weights, measures, and currencies facilitated exchange across vast distances. These policies served both economic and military purposes, as prosperous trade networks provided both information and resources that supported continued expansion. The first great test of this reorganized force came with the invasion of the Western Xia Kingdom in 1209, a campaign that served as both a training exercise for the unified Mongol army and a statement of intent to the world beyond the steppes. The siege of fortified cities required new tactical approaches that combined traditional Mongol mobility with siege techniques learned from Chinese engineers and Persian craftsmen. The systematic reduction of Xia resistance demonstrated that the nomadic warriors could adapt to any form of warfare, making them as dangerous to settled civilizations as they were to rival steppe tribes. The Western Xia campaign was carefully chosen as the first target for Mongol expansion, as it provided opportunities to test new military techniques while attacking a kingdom that was wealthy enough to make victory profitable, but not strong enough to pose serious risks if the campaign encountered unexpected difficulties. The Xia capital of Zhongxing contained treasures and technologies that would enhance Mongol capabilities, while the kingdom's position along the Silk Road made its conquest strategically valuable for future operations. The siege techniques that the Mongols developed during the Xia campaign represented a synthesis of steppe mobility and Chinese engineering that would prove devastatingly effective against fortified positions throughout their empire. Mobile siege towers constructed by captured Chinese engineers could be rapidly assembled and moved into position, while traditional Mongol archery provided covering fire that suppressed defenders during the crucial moments of assault. The psychological impact of these combined tactics was as important as their military effectiveness, as cities that witnessed the fall of their neighbors often chose to surrender rather than face the systematic destruction that awaited those who resisted. The conquest of the Jin dynasty represented an even greater challenge, as it required the Mongols to overcome defensive systems that had protected northern China for centuries. The Great Wall, built to keep nomadic raiders at bay, proved no obstacle to an army that possessed both the tactical flexibility to find weak points and the administrative sophistication to maintain supply lines across vast distances. The capture of Beijing in 1215 shocked the civilized world, proving that no fortress or fortification could withstand the new style of warfare that Genghis Khan had perfected. The fall of Beijing was preceded by a siege that lasted nearly 2 years, demonstrating both the persistence and the adaptability that characterized Mongol military operations. The city's formidable defenses had been strengthened over centuries and were manned by experienced soldiers who understood the importance of their position to the survival of the Jin dynasty. However, the Mongol siege techniques gradually wore down the defenders' resistance while preventing any possibility of relief from external forces. The psychological warfare that accompanied the siege was as devastating as the physical attacks, as Genghis Khan systematically destroyed the rural areas around Beijing to eliminate any hope of support from the countryside. Refugees streaming into the city brought reports of wholesale destruction and tales of Mongol brutality that gradually demoralized the population. The Khan's offer of generous terms for surrender contrasted sharply with the fate that awaited cities that continued to resist, creating internal pressure for capitulation that proved as effective as any siege engine. The treasure captured when Beijing finally fell provided the Mongol Empire with unprecedented wealth that would fund future campaigns and attract additional followers from across the known world. The Jin imperial treasury contained centuries of accumulated riches, including gold, silver, precious stones, and artistic masterpieces that demonstrated the sophistication of Chinese civilization. More importantly, the city yielded hundreds of skilled administrators, engineers, and scholars whose expertise would prove invaluable in governing the expanding empire. The systematic destruction that followed the city's capture served both practical and symbolic purposes, as Genghis Khan sought to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to other potential enemies. The deliberate targeting of symbols of Jin authority, palaces, temples, and administrative buildings was designed to break the psychological connection between the population and their former rulers. However, areas of the city that housed useful craftsmen and technologies were carefully preserved, reflecting the pragmatic calculation that characterized all Mongol policy decisions. The campaign against the Khwarezmid Empire demonstrated the true scope of Genghis Khan's ambitions and abilities as he launched a war of revenge that would reshape the entire Middle East. The murder of Mongol ambassadors by the Khwarezmid Shah represented exactly the kind of insult that could not be tolerated by a ruler whose authority depended on the respect and fear of his neighbors. The response was swift and devastating, as Mongol armies poured across the Amu Darya River in 1219, with orders to destroy an empire that had dared to challenge the universal ruler's authority. The incident that triggered this massive campaign began as a routine trade negotiation, as Genghis Khan had sent a large caravan to the Khwarezmid Empire carrying valuable goods and diplomatic messages designed to establish peaceful relations. The caravan's destruction and the murder of its leaders represented not just an economic loss, but a fundamental violation of the diplomatic principles that the great Khan was trying to establish throughout his expanding empire. The insult to his authority required a response that would demonstrate to the entire world the consequences of treating Mongol representatives with anything less than complete respect. The military preparations for the Khwarezmid campaign were conducted on a scale that demonstrated the organizational capabilities that Genghis Khan had developed during his years of expansion. Armies totaling more than 200,000 warriors were assembled from across the Mongol Empire, with contingents drawn from Mongolia, northern China, and recently conquered territories in Central Asia. The logistical planning required to coordinate such massive forces across thousands of miles of difficult terrain represented an administrative achievement that rivaled any military victory. The siege of Otrar, where the original insult had taken place, became a masterpiece of psychological warfare as Genghis Khan personally supervised the systematic destruction of the city and the execution of every inhabitant. The governor who had ordered the murder of the Mongol ambassadors was killed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a fate that was reported throughout the Islamic world as a warning of what awaited those who defied Mongol power. The symbolism was clear. Those who harmed Mongol representatives would suffer punishments that reflected both the creativity and the implacability of their sovereign's vengeance. The elaborate nature of the governor's execution was carefully calculated to create maximum psychological impact throughout the region, as Genghis Khan understood that spectacular punishments could be more effective than conventional military victories in persuading potential enemies to submit without resistance. The story of the molten silver spread rapidly through trade networks and diplomatic channels, creating a climate of terror that preceded Mongol armies and often achieved victory before the first arrow was fired. The pursuit of the fleeing Khwarezmid Shah across Persia and into the Caucasus demonstrated the global reach that Mongol power had achieved under Genghis Khan's leadership. Armies that had begun their campaigns on the steppes of Mongolia found themselves fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iran, and the forests of Russia. The logistical achievement represented by these far-flung operations was as impressive as any tactical victory, proving that the Mongol military system could function effectively across any terrain and against any enemy. The division of Mongol forces during the pursuit allowed Genghis Khan to demonstrate the flexibility and coordination capabilities that made his military organization so effective. While he personally led the main army in pursuit of the Shah, other columns struck at strategic targets throughout the Khwarezmid Empire, ensuring that resistance would be crushed even if the primary target managed to escape. This multi-pronged approach prevented the enemy from concentrating their forces for effective resistance while maximizing the psychological impact of Mongol operations. The destruction of Samarkand, Bukhara, and other ancient centers of Islamic civilization created a level of devastation that would be remembered for centuries as a watershed moment in world history. These cities, which had been centers of learning and culture for generations, were reduced to ruins, populated only by the dead, and the few survivors left to spread word of Mongol power. The systematic destruction of irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure ensured that recovery would take decades, creating wasteland where prosperous regions had once flourished. The fall of Samarkand was particularly shocking to the Islamic world, as the city had been regarded as one of the most beautiful and sophisticated urban centers in the known world. The systematic destruction of its libraries, schools, and artistic treasures represented not just a military victory, but a cultural catastrophe that eliminated centuries of accumulated learning and creativity. The deliberate targeting of intellectual and cultural institutions demonstrated Genghis Khan's understanding that true conquest required the elimination of the ideas and institutions that gave meaning to people's lives. Yet even in the midst of this systematic destruction, Genghis Khan continued to demonstrate the pragmatic intelligence that had enabled his rise to power. Craftsmen, engineers, and scholars were spared and relocated to Mongolia, where their skills could serve the growing empire. Religious leaders who submitted peacefully were protected and honored, ensuring that the spiritual needs of conquered populations would be met. Administrative systems that proved effective were preserved and adapted, creating a synthesis of Mongol and local practices that enhanced the efficiency of imperial government. The selection process for preserving useful individuals from conquered cities was conducted with remarkable sophistication, as Mongol administrators had developed criteria for identifying people whose skills would be valuable to the empire. Artisans who could produce weapons, luxury goods, or siege engines were automatically spared, while scholars who possessed knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, or medicine were recruited for service in the imperial administration. This systematic preservation of human capital ensured that conquest would enhance rather than diminish the empire's capabilities. The personal cost of these campaigns was enormous, as Genghis Khan spent the final years of his life far from the homeland he loved, pursuing enemies across landscapes that held no spiritual significance for a man whose soul belonged to the eternal blue sky of Mongolia. The death of his youngest son, Tolui, during the Persian campaign created grief that even the universal ruler could not entirely suppress, while the constant demands of military leadership left little time for the family relationships that had once brought him joy. The distance from Mongolia created both practical and emotional challenges for Genghis Khan, as he struggled to maintain control over his original power base while managing the complexities of governing a vast empire. Communications with the homeland required weeks or months, making it difficult to respond quickly to developments that threatened Mongol unity. The spiritual connection to the sacred landscapes of his birth became increasingly attenuated as he spent years campaigning in foreign territories that held no meaning within his traditional belief system. The return to Mongolia in 1225 provided only brief respite from the demands of empire, as Genghis Khan immediately began planning new campaigns that would extend Mongol power into India and Europe. The aging conqueror understood that momentum was essential to maintaining the loyalty of followers who expected constant opportunities for advancement and wealth. The empire he had created was like a vast machine that required constant feeding with new conquests and fresh challenges to prevent stagnation and internal conflict. The homecoming celebration was bittersweet, as Genghis Khan found that his long absence had created changes in Mongol society that reflected the empire's transformation from a steppe confederation into a global power. Many of his original followers had died in distant campaigns, while their sons knew more about Chinese cities than Mongolian grasslands. The traditional way of life that had shaped his character was gradually disappearing as the Mongols adapted to the demands of governing sedentary populations. The final campaign against the Western Xia represented both a practical necessity and a personal vendetta, as Genghis Khan sought to punish a kingdom that had failed to provide promised military support during the Persian Wars. The systematic destruction of Xia resistance demonstrated that the great Khan's capacity for ruthless vengeance had not diminished with age, while the tactical innovations displayed by Mongol forces showed that their military capabilities continued to evolve and improve. The Xia campaign was conducted with particular brutality because Genghis Khan viewed their failure to honor alliance obligations as a personal betrayal that threatened the entire system of relationships he had built to maintain imperial unity. The kingdom's destruction served as a warning to other vassals and allies that promises made to the Mongol Empire would be enforced regardless of changing circumstances or competing obligations. The hunting accident that led to Genghis Khan's final illness occurred during what should have been a moment of relaxation and pleasure as the aging ruler pursued wild game in the mountains near the Xia border. The fall from his horse that caused internal injuries would have been a minor inconvenience for a younger man, but for a warrior in his 60s who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, it became the beginning of the end. The irony that the world's greatest conqueror would be brought down by the activity he had loved since childhood wasn't lost on those who witnessed his final months. The circumstances of the accident reflected the fatigue and physical decline that had accumulated during decades of constant campaigning, as even Genghis Khan's legendary endurance had limits that were finally being reached. The internal injuries that resulted from the fall were complicated by previous wounds and the general wear that came from a lifetime of physical hardship, creating medical challenges that the primitive medicine of his era could not adequately address. The secrecy surrounding Genghis Khan's death reflected both his personal preference for privacy and the practical necessity of preventing enemies from learning of their opportunity. The great Khan understood that news of his demise might trigger rebellions throughout the empire, particularly in regions that had been recently conquered and remained restive under Mongol rule. His final orders specified that his death should be concealed until his chosen successor could consolidate power and ensure continuity of leadership. The elaborate deception that surrounded his final months required the cooperation of his closest advisors and family members, who maintained the pretense that he remained in command even as his condition deteriorated. Public appearances were carefully staged to suggest that he remained active and engaged, while important decisions were made in his name by trusted subordinates who understood his methods and priorities. The selection of Urgadai as the new Great Khan demonstrated Genghis Khan's understanding that empire required different skills than conquest, as he chose the son best suited for administration and diplomacy rather than the most accomplished warrior. This decision reflected the strategic vision that had characterized his entire career, as he recognized that the long-term survival of his empire would depend on wise governance rather than continued military expansion. The peaceful transfer of power that followed his death validated his judgment and ensured that his life's work would continue to evolve and flourish. The choice of Urgadai over other potential heirs was controversial among some Mongol nobles who preferred Yochi or Tolui, but it reflected Genghis Khan's sophisticated understanding of the different qualities required for different phases of imperial development. While conquest demanded the aggressive leadership and military genius that had characterized his own career, consolidation required the patience, diplomatic skill, and administrative ability that Urgadai possessed in abundance. The burial of Genghis Khan, according to ancient Mongol traditions, ensured that his final resting place would remain hidden from those who might seek to disturb his eternal rest. The unmarked grave somewhere in the sacred mountains of Mongolia became a symbol of the enduring mystery that surrounded a man who had revealed so much about human potential while remaining essentially unknowable even to his closest followers. The secrecy that surrounded his death matched the enigmatic quality that had characterized his life, leaving future generations to speculate about the sources of his extraordinary achievements. The funeral procession that carried his body back to Mongolia was conducted with elaborate precautions to prevent anyone from identifying the burial location, as participants were sworn to secrecy on pain of death. The route was deliberately circuitous and confusing, while the final ceremonies were conducted by a small group of trusted shamans who took the location's secret to their own graves. In the whisper of wind across the eternal grasslands of Mongolia, in the genetic heritage carried by millions of people across Eurasia, in the trade routes that still connect distant continents, the influence of the boy who became the universal ruler continues to shape our world. His transformation from Temujin, the abandoned child, to Genghis Khan, the master of the world, remains one of history's most compelling demonstrations of human potential and the power of unbreakable will combined with strategic genius. As the stars wheel overhead in the vast darkness above the steppes where his story began, the spirit of Genghis Khan endures as a reminder that extraordinary circumstances can forge extraordinary individuals, that leadership demands both vision and ruthlessness, and that some legacies are too powerful to be contained by the boundaries of any single age or culture. The secret history of the Mongols, that ancient chronicle of his rise to power, preserves his voice across the centuries, with words that capture the essence of his character and ambition. As he once declared to his followers, revealing the philosophy that drove his unprecedented conquests, "The greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies and chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth and see those dear to them bathed in tears, to ride their horses and clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters." These words, harsh as they may sound to modern ears, reflect the uncompromising spirit of a man who reshaped the world through force of will and strategic brilliance, whose legacy continues to challenge our understanding of leadership, power, and the complex relationship between individual ambition and historical change. Thus ends our journey across the boundless steppes of Mongolia and through the extraordinary life of Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler whose empire touched every corner of the known world. May his example remind us that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that human potential knows no bounds, and that the echoes of extraordinary lives can resonate across the centuries to inspire and challenge us still. The end. Thank you for joining the sleepy historian on this epic ride across the steppes of history and into the life of one of humanity's most remarkable figures. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the infinite possibilities that await those bold enough to chase their destiny across the horizon.